Hello and welcome to this video. In this video, I want to talk about why it is a good idea to involve a statistician or methodologist early on in your project when you run an empirical study, rather than asking a statistician or methodologist after the fact when you're done with your data collection to help you out with your data analysis. My name is Geiser. I'm a statistical consultant and instructor with QuantFish, and on this channel I present weekly statistics tutorials. On Tuesdays I usually address an issue in the Mplus software, and on Thursdays I talk about more general issues in multivariate statistical analysis, including structural equation modeling, multi-level analysis, and latent class modeling. If this is something that interests you, then please subscribe to this channel. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and to check out the description for additional resources, including a link to my weekly statistics newsletter, as well as workshops that I'm offering through QuantFish. So in this video, I want to talk about a general issue that I often encounter in my work as a statistical consultant, and that is that I frequently run into the issue where people consult me after they have already finished their study, which is not per se a bad thing, but can be a bad thing when it turns out that the study had significant design flaws, for example, with regard to the sample size, with regard to the measures that were collected, or with regard to the experimental design. And so then what often happens is that people get frustrated or are disappointed when they learn later on that they cannot do with their data what they were planning to do. For example, maybe they were planning to run a complex latent growth mixture model for longitudinal data, or they were planning to run some other kind of latent variable model, and then they learn that their sample size is too small and is insufficient for analyzing a complex statistical model that they had planned to analyze. Also, what often happens is that people realize after the fact that they don't have sufficient statistical power for the effects that they were trying to find, and that the sample size wasn't large enough, or there were other issues with the data that don't allow them to determine the effects as being statistically significant. And so this can then be frustrating when you learn this after the fact, and you can't do anything about it anymore because you already have completed your data collection. You can't go back and collect more data perhaps, or you can't change the study design at this point, and then oftentimes you cannot do what you would like to do. And so therefore my advice is to always try to involve a methodologist or statistician ahead of time before you even do your data collection. So in the planning phase of your empirical study, already get in touch with somebody who can guide you through the process, and then it'll save you a lot of headaches down the road. So down the road, things then become a lot easier. You want things to be easy at the end, not hard at the end when you want to just publish your results. When you're done with your study, you want to not have to deal with a lot of trouble that was not anticipated at the beginning. When you consult with a methodologist or statistician ahead of time, then you can discuss your data collection plan, your sample size. You can look into how you can estimate the appropriate sample size that will be sufficient to obtain sufficient statistical power and to be sufficient for the kind of statistical model that you want to run. This is something that can be examined, for example, by Monte Carlo simulation studies. You can do some simulation work ahead of time to be sure that with a sample size that is feasible for you, that you can actually run the model that you want to run, and that you can find the effects that you want to find, meaning that you have enough statistical power. And so this is something that a methodologist can help you with. Also, a methodologist might point you to different alternative methods, statistical methods, different models, and he or she might be able to give you a choice between maybe statistical models that are simpler versus more complex. Then you can see what you feel comfortable with. Also, the statistician can point you to software options. Then you can see whether, for example, you're comfortable running a latent class analysis in the Mplus software or some kind of analysis in the R software, for example. And so you can discuss ahead of time what kind of statistical method might be ideal for you. This is something that I also very often notice, that people didn't really think about how to analyze their data ahead of time. And so then they come later on with their data set and they are proud that they have collected all this data, but they have never thought through how it would be analyzed. And then oftentimes it becomes difficult, or it's more difficult to retroactively figure out what statistical analysis they should use given the data. It would be easier to think about it ahead of time and then plan the data collection and the selection of variables ahead of time. For example, oftentimes people want to run a structural equation model with latent variables after they have collected their data, but then they realize that they don't have multiple indicators, or that they maybe have not enough indicators to where they could meaningfully specify a latent variable model, or not the right indicators where the indicators don't form a unidimensional scale. So issues of reliability and validity and factor structure, that's also something that a methodologist, a psychometrician or statistician can advise you on. He or she can look over your items ahead of time, and oftentimes we can already figure out whether a factor model, for example, will work for the data. We can see, oh, these items maybe are not unidimensional. They don't look like you could fit a single factor model to these items. Could you maybe find different items, or could you revise some of the items, or maybe the response format is something that is not easy to deal with after the fact. So taken together, it's really a good idea to think a lot of these things through before you run your study. And there may be things that you may not anticipate, but that a statistician methodologist may anticipate, because we look at the data collection from a different angle. We think about it from the perspective of, oh, how would we analyze this later on, and what kind of issues could come up when we analyze the data. Another example are missing data, for example. Many people don't think about the fact that they will probably have missing data at the end, and then how to deal with them. So a lot of times people select an ad hoc kind of way to address missing data, for example, list-wise deletion, where a lot of their data gets thrown away afterwards, and then they end up maybe with an underpowered study because they have a much smaller sample size at the end than what they anticipated. And so thinking about missing data is important, not just how they can be avoided, but also how you will address them, because oftentimes missing data cannot be avoided. For example, in longitudinal studies, it's almost inevitable that some people will not show up at later time points. There will always be some amount of dropout, and so then you can plan this accordingly, and you can also make sure that you, for example, include relevant auxiliary variables in your data collection. So that means variables that may be related to dropout over time that you can then later on use as pieces of information when you use a missing data strategy, like for example, full information maximum likelihood estimation or multiple imputation. Then you can use those auxiliary variables to help with the missing data mechanism, or to help establish something that approximates missing at random data. For that, auxiliary variables can be good. So planning your study ahead of time with these auxiliary variables can be very important. So there are a lot of things to consider, including the sample size, the variables to include in your analysis, missing data, the statistical model to be analyzed later on. And so all these things should be discussed ideally ahead of time. Before you run your study, consult with a statistician methodologist, have a few meetings, and then a lot of the problems can be avoided that you might run into. It is much harder to address these issues after the fact when the study is done. Many of those then can't be addressed well anymore. It can't be changed anymore. But ahead of time, when you think those through ahead of time, then it's much easier down the road when you already know how you will address your data with statistical methods and how you will deal with all the kinds of things that you might encounter in your studies. I hope you found this video useful as you think about planning your next study. If you did, then please hit the like button. Also feel free to leave a comment in the comment section and let me know what you think about these issues. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and to check out the description for additional resources, and I'll see you next time.